to this lesson of the Polgar Chess University. Today we'll talk about pins. Pins are one of the most important tactical elements in chess, and let me demonstrate it right away with some examples. Here we go. In this position, Black has an advantage of a pawn. Also, Black has a nice battery set up with his bishop and queen on the longest light square diagonal on the chessboard. The white queen is busy guarding the pawn on g2, making sure Black doesn't give checkmate there. However, despite the fact that seemingly Black is the one ahead, White, with his next move, can gain major advantage. The important point that you need to remember regarding pins is that when you have two of your pieces on the same file or diagonal, like in this case, your king and queen, you have to be very careful not to get into trouble. In this position, White can play bishop to b3, attacking the Black queen on d5, and that queen cannot leave this diagonal, getting out of the bishop's way, because that would leave the king in attack from the bishop, and that's not allowed by the rules. This is an example of an absolute pin. Later in this lesson, we'll also learn about the relative pin. The difference between an absolute pin and a relative pin is that when we talk about an absolute pin, like in this position, the queen absolutely cannot, by the rules, move out of the pin. On the other hand, when we are talking about a relative pin, then what we mean is that the front piece, like the queen in this case, is allowed to move away, but would still lose a valuable piece behind. So when we talk about pins, there are always three participants. There is the piece of one color, that's the pinning piece, with two pieces of the opposite color, one in the front and one in the back. And they are always all three pieces on the same diagonal, like in this case, or same file or rank in some other cases that we'll see. What is also important is that the bishop on b3 would be on a protected square, like here. So if the Black queen would choose to capture that bishop right now, to make sure White would have at least one piece to capture the queen, which in this case either the pawn or the queen can do. Let's see some more examples that demonstrate the same idea. Here we go. In the second position, Black has material advantage, having a valuable piece such as the rook worth 5 points, while White only has a bishop as its most valuable piece, a bishop on c3 worth 3 points. True, White has an extra pawn. Now this is an important situation because White has a natural move to capture the Black pawn on a5, which is not a bad move, but by no means the best. White can do better by creating a pin over the Black king and rook. Can you see the move? It is moving the bishop to e5, attacking the rook, and the rook is not allowed to move anywhere because it is in an absolute pin. And then, of course, after king would move out, White would gain 2 points by giving up a 3-point piece for a 5-point piece. And then this would be an easily won pawn endgame, where White would of course need to hurry up and bring the king to help the passed pawn on the e file and would win the game. At this point, I'm not going to focus on this technical part on how to promote that e pawn, but basically you would bring your king and start pushing the pawn and move the king forward, aiding the pawn. Let's go back and focus on pins in this lesson. In this position, the white bishop has just been attacked by the black pawn on h6. Should that bishop move away? Normally, that would be the answer. And this is also a perfect example to show that when you see a good move, a natural move, look around, see if you may have a better one. And in this case, after seeing two examples of bishop pins, now we'll see how a rook can pin. Obviously, the rook does not pin on diagonals because the rook is a linear piece not moving on diagonals, but the rook can pin on ranks and files. Like in this case, moving the rook up to the same rank where black, king, and queen is. Again, important element that the white bishop protects the rook, so after queen would take the rook, the bishop could take the queen, gaining 4 points by giving up a 5-point piece for a 9-point piece. Let's see another example of the rook's ability to pin, and this is a very common example when one side delays castling, which they shouldn't. Typically, you should try to castle within the first 6 to 8 moves. In this game, black did not do that and left the king in the middle of the board in its starting position while putting the queen on the same file. And here the solution is to put one of the rooks on the e file. Doesn't particularly matter which one, either one works. And the queen cannot leave the e file because it's in a pin, it's in an absolute pin, and whether the queen now captures the rook or black castles, for example, the queen will be lost for a rook. Let's move on and see an example how the queen can pin. In this position, black has just moved his queen to g4, offering an exchange of queens. But white can do better, noticing two pieces of blacks on the same rank, on the 7th rank. By putting the white queen along that same rank on b7, attacking the bishop on e7, white can win a bishop. Black has no good way of protecting the bishop, and of course the bishop is in an absolute pin, so it cannot move away. Much better than trading queens. Let's go on. In this position, again, the queen is the hero. At the moment, black has a clear material advantage, having an extra bishop while also 2 rooks compared to white's queen. But here again, sadly for black, the black king and rook on e5 are both on the same diagonal with no piece in between them, which is important because, for example, if this pawn from g6 would be back on g7, then it wouldn't be a problem because then after the key move queen a1, that rook could move away. As I said, if the pawn on g6 would be back on g7, but it's not, and therefore the rook right now cannot move away. And the rook is lost. Let's move on to see some examples when we talk about relative pins instead of absolute pins. Here we go. In this position, we can notice again two key pieces, two of the strongest black pieces, the queen and the rook, being on the same diagonal. And white has an opportunity to put his bishop, a lower value piece, on that same diagonal. Remember, if you would put a queen to where the bishop is right now, that would do nothing, because the queen wouldn't really be threatening a rook on e7 because it's a higher value piece than the rook. So it's also important here that the bishop is only a 3-point value piece compared to the rook or the queen, much higher. In this case, unlike in all the previous positions in this lesson, the rook has the ability to move away, but of course that would be regretful for black, because then black would lose an even stronger piece than the rook. So therefore, black wouldn't want to do that. After bishop g5, black would rather, for example, move the queen out of the pin, and now it would be urgent for the bishop to take the rook before it would run away, and white would win 2 points. Let's move on to a similar example. Hopefully you can figure this one out after seeing the last one. And the answer is very similar to the previous one, putting the white bishop again on the same diagonal with the black queen and rook. Again, it's a relative pin and black loses based on the same ideas as in the previous example. Let's see some other examples where the pin already exists. In this position, we already have an existing pin, but in itself, it doesn't mean much, because the rook is of a higher value than the bishop. But at the moment, the bishop is guarded by the pawn on c6. So capturing the bishop wouldn't do anything, because we would give up a higher value piece for a lower value piece. What white needs to do here is make a move that normally wouldn't be possible, moving the pawn up to c4. As you can see now, the pawn, a lower value piece, is attacking the bishop, a higher value piece, using the pin that the bishop cannot capture the pawn because it is in an absolute pin. A very important motive in taking advantage of an already existing pin. Let's see another example on the same theme. Here we go. In this position, white is in a check. Another important message: make sure when you get a check, you don't automatically have to move your king. Try to see what should be white's next move here. Well, if it's not moving the king, capturing the bishop on d4 wouldn't be that great because the knight is protecting the bishop. The answer is playing e3. This is a check, a counter check, amazingly, and a fork at the same time. White checks the black king and attacks the black bishop. And what's important is that this is a good move because the black bishop is in a pin. You can see the white rook on the 4th rank, as well as the black king and black bishop. So therefore, the black bishop is in an absolute pin and is not allowed to capture the white pawn because it would leave the black king in a check. After the black king moves out of the check, white can capture the bishop with the pawn. Let's move on and see another example when again the bishop is the hero. This is a very typical situation when black has castled to the king's side and happened to move his king to g7 already, protecting his knight on f6. As we can see, there is a pin already on the dark squared long diagonal, but capturing the knight immediately on f6 wouldn't do much because the bishop and the knight are of equal value and the black king would simply recapture. So what should white do? This is the beautiful part about pins, that it enables to put certain pieces on squares where they normally could not go. For example, in this case, that correct move is to move the knight to e4. If it wasn't for the pin, the black knight could capture the white knight. But because the white bishop is where it is on c3, pinning the black knight, resulting in an absolute pin, black cannot do that. And then on the next move, white can freely capture the black knight on f6. On the same theme, let's see another example. Here we go. Now white does not have a knight to aid the bishop in using the pin. On the other hand, the white g-pawn is already further advanced and ready to take over that role. And white would just move the pawn up using the pin. And again, the black knight is lost. And let's see one more version on the same theme. Here we go. Now there is no knight. The pawn is not ready to help, but the rook is. See, now the rook moves to d6, again putting pressure on the knight. The knight cannot run away because it's in a pin, not allowed to. And let's move on to a different type of position. Here we go. In this position, it is black who has an extra knight. Both sides have queens and rooks and equal number of pawns. The white queen again is pinning the black knight, so all they would need to do is to attack that piece a second time. And the best way to do that is to move the rook to c1, and the knight is helpless. On the next move, white will capture the knight. Let's move on, and here we go. This is an interesting example where the black bishop is pinning the white queen on e3 because the white king is behind it. It cannot run away. However, here, black has miscalculated because white also has a pin along the h2 and b8 diagonal. And therefore, white is able to safely capture the bishop on b6. Look at that. The black pawn is unable to capture the white queen because of the pin. So it's one of those examples, who laughs hardest, who laughs the last. Let's see another example. Here we go. In this example, again, there is already an existing pin along the c-file, and that restricts greatly the black knight's mobility on c6. And using that, white is able to capture black's rook on d4, because now, after knight capturing the queen, rook would capture the queen, winning material and, in fact, checkmating. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. In this position, there is a pin that at first seems unimportant along the long light squared diagonal. What it means is that if that pawn from d5 would need to move, white would be able to capture black's rook in the corner on a8. The only way we can make that being important is by capturing the black knight on c4. Now, if the black pawn does not capture the white rook, then white just won a knight. On the other hand, if it does capture it, then white still won a knight by capturing the black rook. Look out for similar opportunities. Let's see another example in a rook and bishop endgame. Such endgames typically end in a draw when there are equal material. But here, because the black bishop is already in a pin, black gets in trouble. Of course, only if white right now finds the correct move, which is giving up the c pawn, attacking the bishop on d5, and white would be very happy if black captures that pawn because of rook takes rook. Typically, you should try to avoid losing material, but if you cannot, you should minimize it. In that spirit, black's best choice would be to play c6 and relatively just lose the bishop for a pawn, which is much less of a loss than losing a rook for a pawn. And finally, I'd like to show you a miniature game where white uses the element of a pin to checkmate real quick. Let's see. e4, c6. This is called the Caro-Kann defense. White puts both his center pawns in the middle of the board, certainly a good thing to do. d5, this is so far very common opening moves, and white protects the pawn on e4. Black trades, and typically when a trade happens, we want to recapture, and black plays knight d7, developing. Here the common moves would be to develop with the knight or with the bishop and castle as soon as possible. This is an example that sometimes accidentally bad moves can work out as well. Here white has a very tricky move that you should be aware of, playing queen e2. It's not a good move, therefore I don't recommend you to do it, but it's certainly important to know the idea, and if you have the black pieces, to make sure you don't fall into the trap. It's a bad idea because it moves in front of the bishop, and therefore that bishop will have difficulties to get out. Or the queen will need to waste more time to make another move. Here black makes a mistake by continuing to develop his knight. Can you see the coming checkmate now? It's not capturing the knight because then black would recapture. However, in this position, the quick checkmate comes with knight to d6, smothered mate. The black pawn is unable to capture the knight because of the existing pin. A very famous, cute little game. What should have black done to prevent this? Well, black has several ways. The best one would be to move the pawn up one square, and then of course there is no more knight d6 checkmate because the bishop would capture the knight. Another way to prevent the checkmate could be moving the queen out to c7, so after knight d6 the queen could capture the knight. Well, I hope you enjoyed learning about the pins. Pins are a very important element in chess, happens all the time. At the same time, remember, not every pin is deadly. So always be aware of it and look out for opportunities to take advantage of it. But also, don't be afraid of it. Look out for your opponent's options to use it, but if there is no way to use it, it's not the end of the world. Another thing, generally it's best to get out of it, just to avoid any future trouble, even if there isn't an immediate one. So, creating pins to pin your opponent's pieces is a good thing because you restrict their mobility. On the other note, if you are in a pin, try to get out of it as soon as possible. Thank you for listening. So long until next week.